They thought you were lost. That was the easiest conclusion for them to reach. From the outside, it looked that way. You were quieter than before, less reactive, less visible. You no longer rushed to explain where you were going or what you were becoming. To them, silence meant confusion. Distance meant failure. Stillness meant defeat. Distance meant failure. Stillness meant defeat. But they were wrong. You weren't lost. You were shedding layers that no longer belonged to you. There is a phase in growth that looks like collapse to those who don't understand transformation. A phase where movement slows, where noise fades, where clarity forms quietly instead of loudly. You had entered that phase without announcing it, and that's why they misread you. They were used to the version of you that tried to be understood, the version that spoke often, explained deeply, reacted quickly. That version made them comfortable because it was predictable. This new version didn't offer that comfort, so they assumed something was wrong. They asked subtle questions disguised as concern. They watched you closely, searching for signs of weakness. They interpreted your quiet as uncertainty, your restraint as hesitation. They couldn't imagine that silence could be deliberate. But inside you, something was shifting. You were dismantling old beliefs, letting go of outdated identities, relearning yourself without the pressure of being perceived correctly. That kind of work doesn't announce itself. It happens inwardly, patiently, away from applause. While they talked, you observed. While they speculated, you reflected. While they assumed, you evolved. You stopped seeking validation for every step you took. You stopped explaining your process to people who only understood outcomes. You realized that most people only respect results, not the discipline required to reach them. So you worked in silence. They mistook your withdrawal for weakness. They didn't see the focus. They didn't feel the internal pressure you were applying to yourself. They didn't hear the conversations you were having with your own limits. You were rebuilding your foundation, and foundations are laid underground. Growth is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet to the point of invisibility. Sometimes it looks like stagnation when it's actually preparation. You understood that. They didn't. They thought you were falling behind because you weren't racing anymore. What they didn't see was that you had stopped running in the wrong direction. You began choosing depth over speed, precision over noise, alignment over approval. That choice isolated you, but it also strengthened you. You noticed how much energy you saved by not reacting to every opinion. How much clarity emerged when you stopped defending yourself. How powerful it felt to move without explaining. They interpreted your calm as surrender. But it was discipline. They assumed you had given up. But you had simply stopped showing your progress prematurely. You were no longer interested in proving potential. You were committed to building reality. Inside, you were refining habits, sharpening awareness, studying yourself with honesty. You confronted weaknesses you used to avoid. You sat with discomfort instead of escaping it through distraction or validation. That work changed you. Slowly, your priorities shifted. What once felt urgent no longer mattered. What once felt important lost its weight. You became selective with your time, your energy, your attention. They noticed the distance. They didn't understand the reason. You weren't distancing yourself from them. You were aligning yourself with what you were becoming. Evolution requires isolation at some point. Not permanent isolation, but intentional withdrawal. A space where you can hear your own thoughts without interference. You had created that space. They called it being lost, but lost people panic. Lost people cling. Lost people seek direction from others. You were doing the opposite. You trusted the process even when it was invisible. You trusted yourself when there was no external confirmation. You stayed committed when there was no applause. That kind of faith doesn't make sense to people who measure worth by visibility. They talked about you when you weren't around, wondered what went wrong, assumed you peaked and declined. They felt comfortable underestimating you because it made them feel safe. You let them. Underestimation is a gift when you know who you are becoming. You use the quiet to grow without interference, to fail privately, to learn without judgment, to rebuild without judgment, to rebuild without pressure. Inside you, discipline replaced motivation. Consistency replaced excitement. Patience replaced urgency. Those are not glamorous changes. They don't impress observers, but they create permanence. They thought nothing was happening because nothing was being shown, but you were becoming dangerous in the calmest way possible. Your mind grew sharper, your reactions slower, your decisions clearer. You stopped wasting energy on what didn't serve the long term. You learned the power of delayed visibility. When you stopped announcing your moves, you started moving better. When you stopped explaining your vision, you started executing it. When you stopped seeking validation, you started becoming undeniable. They still thought you were lost, and that was fine, because greatness often looks like disappearance before it looks like dominance. You understood something they didn't. Growth is lonely before it is respected. Evolution is quiet before it is recognized. You weren't becoming great for them to see. You were becoming great so you could stand on your own. Inside, you felt the difference. The confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was rooted, stable, real. You no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. Time would do that for you. They would eventually notice the change, the results, the presence, the strength. But by then, their opinions wouldn't matter, because you didn't evolve to be understood. You evolved to be unstoppable. They thought you were lost, but you were just becoming. They never saw the nights when you questioned yourself in silence, the moments when doubt tried to convince you that slowing down meant failing. They didn't witness the discipline it took to keep going without reassurance, without feedback, without proof that anyone believed in what you were becoming. You did, and that was enough. There is a kind of strength that only develops when no one is watching, when effort goes unnoticed, when progress has no audience. You were building that strength day by day, quietly reinforcing parts of yourself that used to collapse under pressure. You stopped measuring yourself by external timelines. You stopped comparing your pace to people who were running entirely different races. You understood that evolution doesn't follow schedules meant for performance. It follows readiness. While they stayed busy being seen, you stayed focused on becoming. You learned to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it, to let questions exist without forcing immediate answers, to move forward even when the path wasn't fully visible. That patience rewired you. They mistook your lack of urgency for lack of ambition. They couldn't see that you were no longer chasing short-term validation. You were investing in long-term mastery. Your silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Inside you, standards were rising. Tolerance for distractions dropped. You became less impressed by noise and more committed to substance. You no longer needed excitement to feel alive. Progress itself became enough. They kept assuming you were unsure of yourself. In reality, you had never been more certain. Certainty doesn't always speak. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets time reveal what words never could. You were refining your identity without announcing the process, removing what was unnecessary, strengthening what mattered, letting go of habits that once comforted you but no longer served your direction. That kind of change isn't dramatic, it's subtle, but it's irreversible. They thought you were stuck because they couldn't see movement. They didn't realize that the most important shifts were happening beneath the surface, that your mindset was restructuring, that your priorities were recalibrating. You were no longer reacting to life, you were shaping it. You stopped needing approval to continue. You stopped needing acknowledgement to feel progress. You learned to trust internal evidence over external applause. That made you dangerous in the quietest way. When you finally spoke, your words carried weight. When you acted, your actions were intentional. When you decided, you didn't hesitate. That composure was built during the phase they called being lost. They were wrong. You weren't lost. You were becoming unfamiliar to them because you were no longer built for their expectations. You had outgrown the version of yourself they understood. And growth always looks like loss to those who only recognize what they can label. You kept going anyway, because evolution doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait to be understood. It simply continues, and one day they would look at you. As time moved forward, you became more comfortable with being misunderstood. Not in a bitter way, not in a detached way, but in a grounded, accepting way. You realized that misunderstanding was no longer a threat to you. It had become background noise. You stopped correcting narratives that weren't yours to fix. You stopped interrupting assumptions just to protect your image. You understood that people often see what aligns with their limits, not your reality, and so you let them see whatever they needed to see. Inside, you were no longer the same person who once needed reassurance to keep going. Your confidence didn't come from praise anymore. It came from repetition, from discipline, from showing up for yourself even on days when motivation was absent. Those days mattered the most. You began to respect silence differently. It was no longer something you filled out of discomfort. It became a space where clarity formed, where decisions matured, where impulsive reactions dissolved before they could become regrets. They assumed your quiet meant confusion. In truth, it meant focus. You had learned how to listen to yourself without outside interference, how to separate intuition from fear, how to recognize when resistance was a sign of growth, not a signal to stop. That awareness changed the way you moved through the world. You no longer chased opportunities that didn't align. You no longer entertained conversations that drained you. You no longer tolerated environments that required you to shrink. They noticed your absence from places where you once tried to belong. They didn't understand why you stopped showing up. They assumed you had given up. But you hadn't given up. You had opted out. Opting out of chaos. Opting out of comparison. Opting out of living on timelines that weren't yours. That decision gave you room to build something real. While others measured progress by speed, you measured it by depth. While others rushed to be seen, you focused on being solid. You understood that rushing growth creates cracks that only appear later. You were patient enough to avoid that. There were moments when loneliness crept in, when the quiet felt heavy instead of peaceful, when you wondered if being unseen meant being forgotten. But then you remembered why you started. You remembered the exhaustion of constant explanation, the pressure of expectation, the weight of being accessible to everyone but yourself. And the doubt passed. You were no longer afraid of taking longer. You were afraid of becoming shallow. That fear kept you honest. Your inner dialogue shifted. It became less critical and more direct, less emotional and more intentional. You spoke to yourself with clarity instead of judgment. That changed everything. You began to trust your decisions without second-guessing them. You stopped rehearsing conversations that never needed to happen. You stopped imagining outcomes that were out of your control. You focused on what you could shape. Your habits strengthened quietly. Your mindset sharpened slowly. Your tolerance for nonsense dropped without announcement. They felt the difference when they interacted with you. You were calmer, more composed, less reactive. You didn't seek approval or agreement. That unsettled them. They were used to engaging with versions of you that needed to be understood. This version didn't. You no longer overcommitted. You no longer overpromised. You no longer explained why you chose rest over chaos, distance over drama, patience over impulse. You simply chose. And that simplicity carried weight. They started to realize that something had changed, even if they couldn't name it. Your presence was different, not louder, not colder, just steadier. You were no longer proving potential. You were embodying it. The phase they labeled as being lost had stripped you of illusions. It had removed urgency that wasn't yours. It had taught you how to build without audience. That phase shaped you more than any visible success ever could. You understood now that evolution doesn't seek witnesses. It seeks commitment. and you had committed fully. By the time they noticed the results, you had already moved past the need for recognition. Their surprise meant nothing to you. Their validation arrived too late to matter. Because you didn't grow to be applauded, you grew to be aligned. They thought you were lost because they couldn't follow your path. But you were exactly where you needed to be. Still becoming, still refining, still evolving, quietly. You began to realize that the quiet phase was not a pause in your life, but a refinement of it. Every day you spent away from noise was shaping you into someone more deliberate, more controlled, more rooted. You were no longer reacting to the world as it came. You were responding only when it aligned with who you were becoming. That difference mattered. They still looked at you and wondered what went wrong. Why you weren't chasing the same things anymore. Why you didn't seem eager to prove yourself. Why you weren't explaining your choices like you used to. They mistook your lack of urgency for lack of ambition. What they didn't see was the intensity beneath the calm. You were studying yourself closely, watching patterns, identifying weaknesses, replacing old habits with stronger ones. This wasn't visible work. It didn't announce itself. But it demanded more discipline than anything you had done before. You learned how to sit with discomfort without escaping it, how to stay consistent when excitement faded, how to keep moving forward even when progress felt invisible. That kind of resilience doesn't form in loud moments. It forms in silence. They thought you were disconnected. In reality, you were deeply connected to your purpose. You had stopped chasing validation because you finally understood its cost. Every time you sought approval, you delayed your own growth. Every time you explained yourself, you weakened your conviction. You were done trading clarity for comfort. Your internal standards rose quietly. You expected more from yourself than anyone else ever had. You became less tolerant of shortcuts, excuses, and distractions. Not because you were rigid, but because you were focused. Focus changed you. Your energy became controlled. Your attention became intentional. You no longer wasted time convincing people of your worth. You invested that time into becoming undeniable. They didn't hear the conversations you had with yourself, the honest ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones where you admitted what needed to change and took responsibility for it. That accountability shaped you more than praise ever could. You stopped romanticizing struggle and started respecting consistency. You stopped waiting for the perfect moment and committed to daily progress. You stopped needing motivation and built discipline instead. They still thought you were unsure. But uncertainty doesn't look like this. Uncertainty hesitates. Uncertainty seeks reassurance. Uncertainty needs noise. You were steady. You trusted yourself even when no one else did. You trusted the process even when there was no evidence yet. You trusted your direction even when it didn't make sense to others. That trust made you patient. You no longer rushed outcomes. You no longer feared taking longer. You understood that depth takes time, and time rewards those who don't abandon themselves halfway. They began to feel the shift without understanding it. Conversations with you felt different. There was no desperation in your voice, no urgency to be validated, no need to impress. You listened more than you spoke. You responded instead of reacting. You chose silence where you once chose explanation. That calm made people uneasy, because calm without weakness feels powerful. They couldn't predict you anymore. They couldn't read your intentions. They couldn't pull you into old dynamics, and that loss of control unsettled them. But you felt free. Free from expectations that weren't yours, free from roles you had outgrown, free from the pressure to be understood by everyone. You realize that being misunderstood during transformation is normal. Growth changes your language, your priorities, your rhythm. People who only knew the old version of you will struggle to recognize the new one. That didn't mean you were wrong. It meant you were moving forward. You stopped explaining because you no longer needed permission to evolve. You stopped performing progress and started embodying it. You stopped announcing change and allowed it to settle into your character. They thought you were lost because they couldn't see your map, but you weren't wandering, you were building, quietly reinforcing the version of yourself that would not break under pressure, strengthening your mind, aligning your actions, simplifying your life around what truly mattered. The phase they dismissed became the phase that defined you, and one day, without warning, the results would speak for themselves. By then, your silence would no longer be questioned. It would be understood, not because you explained it, but because you lived it.